There are moments in a city that no one is meant to see. They happen on corners and in doorways and at the edges of crosswalks where strangers wait for the light to change, and most of them disappear into the noise of the street before anyone can decide what they were. But on a Tuesday afternoon in January, on the corner of Walnut and 11th in downtown St. Louis, outside a small old pharmacy with a hand-lettered sign in the window, one of those moments happened, and it did not disappear. It would, in time, travel further than anyone standing on that corner could have imagined. It began the way most things that matter begin, with something very small. An old man stepped out of the pharmacy carrying a paper bag and a wooden cane. He paused on the curb to let the wind settle. He looked down once at his shoes, the way old men look down at their shoes when something feels not quite right, and then he looked back up and kept walking. He did not see that the lace of his left shoe had come undone. He did not see that the long end of it was dragging behind him through the slush, gathering ice as it went. He did not see either the boy on the bench across the sidewalk who had been watching him from the moment he came through the door. Before we go any further, take a moment to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are watching from, and if stories like this one tend to stay with you, tap the subscribe button so you do not miss the next one. The old man's name was Edmund Hale, and he was 81 years old. He wore a long camel-colored wool coat that fell almost to his ankles, and a charcoal scarf wound twice around his neck, and his shoes were polished Oxford brogues the color of dark molasses, the kind of shoes a man does not buy more than once or twice in a lifetime. His hair was the soft, deliberate white of a winter field at first light, and he wore a flat tweed cap that he tugged a little lower whenever the wind came up off the river. He did not look like a man in a hurry. He did not, in fact, look like a man who had been in a hurry in many years. He walked the way certain old men walk when they have made peace with their own pace, slowly, evenly, the cane tapping a calm rhythm beside him, as if to remind the sidewalk that it was being crossed. Edmund had been coming to this same pharmacy on the first Tuesday of every month for more than 30 years. The owner, a man named Sal who was now nearly as old as Edmund himself, was the only pharmacist in the city who still handwrote labels on the prescription bottles, and Edmund had a fondness for things that had not yet given up on being done by hand. He could have had any medication in the country delivered to his door by a service that would have done it for free, given who he was. He preferred Sal. He preferred the small bell over the door, and the smell of old wood and clean linoleum, and the way Sal always asked, before anything else, how Edmund's late wife's roses were doing in the garden, even though the roses had not been there in 7 years and Sal knew it, and Edmund knew that Sal knew it, and the asking was a kindness that lived in the not saying. The boy on the bench across the sidewalk was 12 years old. He was thin in the way boys are thin when they have grown too fast and not quite caught up to themselves, with long wrists that came out past the cuffs of a navy hooded sweatshirt and a chin that he kept tucked into his collar against the wind. His name was Theo Whitfield. He was sitting on the bench because the bench was out of the wind, and because the awning of the pharmacy threw a little extra shelter over it, and because he had been told politely that morning that the public library would not be opening on account of a broken pipe. He had a small backpack on his lap, and his arms folded over the top of it, and a paperback book balanced on top of his arms, open to a page he was not really reading. He had been watching the old man for the same reason a boy his age watches anything in a city in winter, which is that watching costs nothing, and the act of paying attention to other people had a way of making him feel, however briefly, like he was still part of the regular world. He saw the lace before Edmund took his second step. The lace was the kind of lace that had been tied 1,000 times by the same hand and had finally decided, on this particular afternoon, that it was tired of being tied. It had slipped its bow somewhere between the prescription counter and the front door, and now the long brown end of it was trailing 2 full feet behind Edmund's left shoe, sliding through the gray slush of the curb with the slow indifference of something that did not know it was about to cause trouble. Edmund took 1 step. He took another. On the 3rd step, the lace caught for a brief instant on the small grate of a storm drain, and Edmund felt the smallest pull at his ankle, and he stopped. He looked down. He saw what had happened. He let out a soft, almost amused breath, the way an old man lets out a breath when his body has presented him with a small inconvenience he is not entirely sure he is equipped to fix. The trouble was the cane. The trouble was also the bag. The cane was in his right hand because his right hip had decided, 3 winters earlier, that it would no longer carry him without assistance, and the paper bag was in his left because it contained a small glass bottle that Sal had wrapped very carefully in tissue, and that Edmund did not want to sit down on the wet sidewalk. He looked around for a bench, but the bench he might have used was occupied by a boy in a navy sweatshirt who was watching him very politely without pretending not to watch him. He looked at a low concrete planter, but the planter was crusted with a rim of dirty ice. He looked finally at the door of the pharmacy behind him, calculating in a quiet, methodical way whether it would be easier to go back inside and ask Sal for a chair. And he had just decided that, yes, that was probably what he would do, when a small voice arrived at his elbow. "Sir," the voice said, "your lace is undone. Let me tie that for you." Edmund turned his head. The boy was already there, already standing in front of him, already lowering himself down onto one knee on the cold, wet pavement with the practiced motion of a person who did not seem to mind kneeling on cold, wet pavement. The boy had set his backpack down beside him on the curb, and the paperback book was tucked under his arm with the spine pressed against his ribs to keep it from falling. His hands, Edmund noticed, were red at the knuckles, the kind of red that comes from being outside in January for longer than is good for a person. But his fingers moved with a calm, deliberate certainty that suggested he had tied a great many laces in his life and was not going to be hurried by the cold. "You don't have to do that, young man," Edmund said, but he said it in the soft, ceremonial way an old man says a thing he does not really mean, the way you decline a second helping at a table where you have already decided to accept one. "It's all right, sir," the boy said. He was not looking up. He was looking at the lace. He took the two ends in his fingers, shook the slush gently off the long end, and pinched the wet part between his thumb and forefinger to wring it out before he began. "My dad showed me a good knot for boots. It holds in the wet. If you want, I can use that one." He paused. He glanced up only briefly, only to check whether the offer had been received properly, and then he looked back down. "It's a little different. But it stays. I would be grateful for a knot that stays," Edmund said. The boy nodded once almost to himself and began to work. Edmund watched the top of the boy's head, the close-cropped dark hair, the soft swirl of a cowlick at the crown that no one had been brushing properly for some time. He watched the careful crossing and tucking of the lace, the small, exact motions of a knot Edmund had not seen tied that way in perhaps 40 years. A knot his own father had taught him in a coal-darkened kitchen in eastern Kentucky on a Sunday afternoon in 1953. The recognition arrived in Edmund's chest before his mind quite caught up to it, and he felt something move in him that he could not yet name, something that had to do with kitchens and Sundays and the patient hands of men who were no longer alive. He held very still. He did not interrupt the boy. He did not want the moment to end any sooner than it had to. The wind came up off the river and pushed at the long hem of his coat. The boy pulled the second loop through, snugged it down, and patted the bow once lightly, the way you pat the lid of a jar to make sure it is closed. "There," the boy said quietly. He sat back on his heel for a moment to look at his work the way a person looks at a small task done properly, and then he rose to his feet in one smooth motion, picking up his backpack as he came. He did not brush at the wet patch on the knee of his jeans where the slush had soaked through. He did not call attention to it at all. He simply stood up and stepped back the appropriate distance and waited, the way a boy waits when he has done a thing for an adult and is not sure whether the adult is going to thank him or wave him away. Edmund looked down at his shoe. The knot was tied tight, and even the loop sitting at exactly the same length, the long ends tucked neatly under the lacing so they would not drag again. It was a knot Edmund's father had called a teamster's bow, though Edmund had heard other men in other places call it by other names, and he had not seen anyone use it in so long that the sight of it on his own foot on a sidewalk in St. Louis in 2026 had the small, disorienting quality of a word from a forgotten language spoken suddenly by a stranger. "That is a fine knot," Edmund said. He looked up at the boy. He took his time about it. The boy was, he realized now that they were standing at the same level, perhaps an inch shorter than the cane, and his eyes were the dark, steady brown of river water under a clouded sky, and there was a small old scar on his lower lip that puckered very slightly when he held his mouth still. "Your father taught you well." "Yes, sir," the boy said. He said it the way certain children say yes, sir, which is to say he said it like the answer to one question and the closing of another. Edmund, who had spent the better part of 8 decades listening to what people did not quite say, noted the closing and did not press against it. He did not ask whether the boy's father had taught him many other knots. He did not ask whether the boy's father was nearby. He did not ask anything at all about the boy's father. He only nodded once slowly and adjusted the paper bag in his left arm. "I am Edmund Hale," he said. The boy considered the name a moment, as if turning it over in his hand to see what it weighed, and then he said, "I'm Theo, sir, Theo Whitfield." Theo. Edmund tried the name with the same care the boy had used in tying the knot, and he found, as he expected, that it was a good one. "That is a name with some history in it, a patient name." "My mother said it meant a gift," Theo said. The small, careful way he placed the word "said" with its quiet past tense did not escape Edmund either, and Edmund again did not press. The two of them stood on the sidewalk in the gray afternoon light, and a city bus went by behind them with a long hiss of brakes, and the wind off the river worked its slow, patient way under the awning of the pharmacy and around the hem of Edmund's coat. "It does mean a gift," Edmund said, "and she was right to give it to you." Theo looked down. He did not know quite what to do with that, and so he busied himself with the strap of his backpack, adjusting it on his shoulder as though it needed adjusting. The paperback book was still tucked under his arm. Edmund glanced at the title without meaning to, the way old readers glance at any book in any hand, and he saw that it was a battered copy of The Call of the Wild, the corners softened from many readings, a library sticker on the spine half-peeled and curling. "That is a good book," Edmund said. Theo looked up. Something in his face shifted very slightly, the way a curtain shifts when a window has been opened in another room. "It's my second time through it," he said. "The library let me keep it longer because they closed today. A pipe broke." "A burst pipe is a fine excuse to read a book twice," Edmund said. Theo smiled. It was a small smile, and it did not last long, but it was the first smile that had crossed his face in the entire encounter, and Edmund saw it and held the memory of it the way a man holds a coin he has found on the ground lightly, with the understanding that it belongs to someone else and that he is only briefly its keeper. "Theo," Edmund said, "may I trouble you for one more small kindness?" "Yes, sir. I would like to sit down for a moment. My hip is reminding me that I have been standing on this curb too long. There is a coffee shop 2 doors down. Would you walk with me?" Theo hesitated. He hesitated the way a boy hesitates when a kindness has been offered to him, and he has not yet learned in his short life whether kindnesses are the kind of thing one accepts or the kind of thing one steps quietly away from. He had been taught both lessons by different people at different times, and he was not always certain which lesson applied to which moment. He looked at the old man. He looked at the cane and the long camel coat and the paper bag with its careful tissue-wrapped contents. He looked finally at the polished Oxford shoes with the new tight knot on the left, and the boy in him who had tied that knot decided, before the rest of him had finished thinking it through, that a man who carried a glass bottle that gently from a pharmacy was probably not a man to be afraid of. "Yes, sir," Theo said. "I can walk with you. Thank you." Edmund shifted the cane in his right hand and gestured very slightly with the bag in his left. "It is only 2 doors. The place is called Murchison's. The coffee is terrible, but the chairs are warm, and the woman who owns it does not mind if a person sits a long while." They walked. Edmund moved at his own deliberate pace, and Theo, who had been moving at the careful, uneven pace of a boy with a separating boot sole for some weeks now, found that the old man's rhythm suited him perfectly. They did not speak as they walked. There was no need. The wind pushed against them, and a man in a thick canvas coat unloading boxes from a delivery truck paused to let them pass on the sidewalk, and a small dog tied to a parking meter outside a sandwich shop watched them go by with the patient interest of an animal who had decided long ago that human beings were largely unknowable, but worth observing anyway. Edmund's cane tapped a steady, even sound on the concrete, and Theo, walking a half-step behind on Edmund's left, matched his own pace to the tapping without meaning to. Murchison's was a long, narrow coffee shop wedged between a tax office and a shoe repair place, with a bell over the door and a chalkboard menu that had not been updated in some time. The bell gave a soft, tired ring as they came through, and a woman behind the counter, perhaps 60, with wire-rimmed glasses pushed up into her short gray hair, looked up from the newspaper she had been reading and broke into the wide, unhurried smile of a person who recognized a long-standing customer. "Edmund Hale," she said. "I was about to call out a search party." "Mary," Edmund said, "forgive me. The first Tuesday came and went, and my hip and I had a small disagreement about whether to leave the house." "And who is this gentleman?" Mary said. Her eyes moved to Theo with the same unsurprised warmth she had shown Edmund. She did not look at the wet patch on his knee or the mismatched shoes or the too-thin sweatshirt. She looked very precisely at his face. "This is Theo," Edmund said. "He kept me from walking the length of Walnut Street with a lace dragging behind me. We have come for a place to sit a moment if you can spare us one." "I can spare you the corner booth," Mary said, "and I can spare you a hot chocolate if Theo would like one, and a cup of the bad coffee if Edmund insists on it." "Yes, please, ma'am," Theo said. He had said it before he quite realized he had said it, the words slipping out ahead of his usual carefulness, because hot chocolate was a word that had not been spoken in his direction in a long while, and his body had answered before his caution could catch up. Mary smiled at him as though he had said exactly the right thing, and then she lifted the hinged section of the counter and waved them through toward the back of the shop with the air of a woman directing two guests to a table she had been keeping for them all afternoon. The corner booth was a high-backed wooden bench against the wall, with a small round table polished smooth by many years of elbows, and a window beside it that looked out onto a narrow side street where a single street lamp had already begun, against all common sense, to flicker on in the early gray. Edmund lowered himself into the booth in stages, the way a tall man with a difficult hip lowers himself into anything. He set the paper bag carefully on the bench beside him so that the glass bottle inside would not be jostled. He leaned the cane against the wall. He let out a long breath, the kind of breath a man releases when the standing portion of his afternoon is finally over, and then he looked across the table at the boy and gestured at the opposite bench. "Sit, Theo," he said. "Take your coat off if you like. We are out of the wind now." Theo slid into the bench opposite Edmund and set his backpack down on the seat beside him with the careful instinct of a boy who had learned not to put bags on the floor in public places. He kept his sweatshirt on. The shop was warm, properly warm, the kind of warmth that had been built up slowly over the course of a long afternoon by a small wall heater behind the counter, and he could feel it beginning to find its way into his fingers. But he had also learned that taking a sweatshirt off in a warm place was a thing you could not easily undo when the warm place ended, and so he kept it on. He placed the paperback on the table in front of him and rested both hands flat on either side of it, palms down, the way a person rests their hands on a steering wheel they are not yet sure how to drive. Mary brought the hot chocolate in a thick white mug with a small ceramic snowman painted on the side, and the coffee in a heavier mug that had no painting on it at all. She set down 2 small plates as well, though no one had asked for plates, and on each plate was a thick slice of something dense and dark and warm, with a soft crumble of brown sugar across the top. "Banana bread came out of the oven 20 minutes ago," Mary said by way of explanation. "I would have to throw it away otherwise. You would both be doing me a kindness." She did not wait for an answer. She turned and went back to her newspaper at the counter. The way a person turns away from a thing they have decided is not up for discussion. Edmund picked up his coffee and held it for a moment between his palms before drinking, the way an old man holds a warm thing because the warmth itself is half the point. He nodded once at the banana bread on Theo's plate. "She has been doing that to me for 26 years, he said. "She has not yet succeeded in throwing any of it away." "It smells very good, sir," Theo said. "Then please," Edmund said, "before it gets cold." Theo did not need to be told twice, though he held himself to the small, dignified pace of a boy who had decided, somewhere in the last several weeks, that there were certain things he was not going to let strangers see in his face. He picked up the fork. He cut a corner of the bread. He put it in his mouth, and he chewed slowly, and he did not close his eyes the way he wanted to, because closing his eyes would have given too much away. He took a small, careful sip of the hot chocolate. He set the mug down. He cut another corner of bread. Edmund did not watch him eat. This was, again, a kindness Theo did not yet have the words for, but registered somewhere in his chest the way a body registers a small, unexpected warmth. Edmund turned his face slightly toward the window. He watched the side street outside, where the street lamp had now decided to commit fully to being on, and a man in a green knit cap was walking a small brown dog along the opposite sidewalk, and a few flakes of snow had begun to drift down out of the gray. "Theo," Edmund said after a quiet while, "your father taught you that knot. May I ask when?" Theo set the fork down. He looked at his hands. "When I was 8, sir. That is a good age to learn a knot like that. He said I had to be old enough to want to do it right." Theo paused. He turned the mug a quarter turn on the table without drinking from it. "He was a long-haul driver. He said the knot was for boots that had to walk through bad weather. He said a good knot was a small promise you made to yourself in the morning." Edmund nodded slowly. He did not ask the next question, which was where Theo's father was now, because he had heard in the careful weight of the past tense that the question had already been answered. He let the quiet sit between them. He took another slow sip of his coffee. Outside, the snow had thickened from a drift into something more committed, and a few of the flakes had begun to settle on the windowsill in small white clusters that would not last long once the wind came back around. "My father taught me that not to," Edmund said after a while. "In a kitchen in Kentucky in the winter of 1953, he was a coal miner. He said almost the same thing your father said, though he used different words. He said a knot you tied well in the morning was the only thing you could be sure of all day." Theo looked up. His eyes were very wide. "He said that? He did. That's almost exactly what my father said. Some things," Edmund said quietly, "do not change very much from one good man to another." Theo did not answer right away. He looked down at the banana bread on his plate, half of it gone now, and at his hands on either side of it, and he found that his eyes had begun, without his permission, to fill with the kind of warm, slow water that he had been refusing to allow them for some weeks. He pressed his lips together. He picked up his fork. He cut another small piece of the bread that he did not entirely want anymore, because cutting the bread gave his hands something to do, and his hands were the part of him that he could still control. Edmund saw all of it. Edmund had seen this particular shape of small private grief many times over many decades, in boardrooms and at gravesides, and once in the back of an army hospital ward in a country that no longer existed by the same name. And he knew, with the precision of a man who had spent his life learning when to speak, and when to let silence carry the heavier load, that the only useful thing he could do now was to look out the window and pretend for a respectful minute. That he had not noticed anything at all. He turned his face toward the snow. He watched a young woman across the street pull her coat tighter and step into a doorway to light a cigarette she had been carrying unlit for the better part of a block. He counted, slowly and without meaning to, the flakes accumulating on the corner of the windowsill. He drank his coffee. He waited. When he looked back, Theo had set the fork down again and folded his hands in his lap, and his eyes were dry, the way the eyes of a boy who has practiced are dry, and only the small reddened rim around the lower lid told Edmund what had been there a moment before. "I'm sorry, sir," Theo said. "I didn't mean to do that." "You did not do anything, Theo." Edmund set his cup down carefully in its saucer. "And there is nothing to be sorry for. It's just that I haven't talked about him in a while." "How long is a while?" Theo thought about it. 2 years, sir, almost 2 years." Edmund nodded. He did not ask the question he wanted to ask. He had learned, over a very long life of meeting people in difficult circumstances, that the most important things a person needed to tell you would arrive in their own time if you let them, and that the surest way to lose a confidence was to reach for it before it had been offered. So he sat. He drank his coffee. He let the radiator behind the counter make its small ticking sounds in the quiet. Mary, behind the counter, turned a page of her newspaper with the soft, dry sound of a person who was not paying any attention to the corner booth, which was the precise sound she had perfected over 26 years of running a small coffee shop on a street where people sometimes came in to do their crying in a warm place. "My mother passed in November," Theo said after a while. He said it the way you say a sentence you have practiced in your own head many times but have not yet spoken out loud. "She was sick for a long time. I was at the hospital with her at the end." "I am sorry to hear that, Theo." "Thank you, sir. And since November—" Theo turned the mug a quarter turn again. He did not answer immediately. He looked at the snow on the windowsill. He looked at the small painted snowman on the side of the mug. He looked finally at the surface of the hot chocolate, which had developed a thin, pale skin where it had been cooling. "Things have been a little hard, sir," he said. "There was supposed to be somebody who came to get me. There were a few people who said they would. They didn't, though. Not yet. I'm still waiting." Edmund did not move. His face did not change. He absorbed the sentence the way the ground absorbs rain on a still afternoon, which is to say completely, and without any visible disturbance of the surface. "And while you wait," he said gently, "where do you stay?" Theo did not answer right away. He looked at his hands. He looked at the paperback on the table, the curling library sticker on its spine. He looked at the soft snow outside the window, falling now in the steadier rhythm of a winter that had decided to be a winter. He had not told anyone any version of this. He had not told the social worker, who had taken his name on a clipboard and said the caseload was very full. He had not told the librarian who had given him an extra week with the book. He had not told the man at the soup kitchen on Olive Street who had asked, kindly, if he had somewhere to go. But he looked at Edmund Hale across the small round table, and he found that he wanted very badly to tell someone. "There's an apartment," Theo said. He kept his voice very level, the way a person keeps a glass of water level when they are carrying it across a room they do not want to spill in. "It was my mother's. The rent was paid up through January because she had a friend at the church who helped. I have a key. I go there sometimes. But there's a woman from the building, the lady downstairs, who has been asking the manager about me, and the manager has been asking her about me, and I think pretty soon somebody is going to come up and knock on the door and I will have to answer it or I won't, and either way it won't be good. So mostly I don't stay there at night. I stay other places. What other places? There's a laundromat that's open all the way through. The man who works the late shift lets me sit in the back if I'm quiet. There's a parking garage near the river that has a stairwell with a heater. There's a library that opens at 9 in the morning. I move around, sir. I try not to be anywhere for too long. And food. There's a kitchen on Olive Street. They serve at noon and at 5. They don't ask too many questions if you come at the back door, and sometimes I have a little money from before my mother passed. She had a coffee can in the back of the cabinet. I take out a little when I need to. I'm careful with it. I bought this sweatshirt at the Goodwill in December. It was $4. Edmund did not say anything. He nodded slowly. He set both of his hands flat on the table on either side of his coffee, the way an old man steadies himself when he has heard a thing he needs a moment to consider properly. The radiator behind the counter ticked. The bell over the door did not ring. No one was coming in from the snow. Mary at the counter very gently turned another page. "Theo," Edmund said after a long moment, "may I ask you one more question, and you do not have to answer it?" "Yes, sir." "Why did you not tell anyone before me?" Theo thought about that. He turned the mug another quarter turn. The snowman on its side rotated out of view and came back around again. "I'm not sure, sir." He paused. The social worker had a clipboard. She wrote down my name and she said I should be patient, and she said the system was full. The lady at the church told me she would pray for me. The man at the kitchen on Olive Street told me there was a shelter, but the shelter is for grown-ups, and the place for kids is somewhere I don't want to go because I heard things about it from a boy who was there. So I just kept going. I thought if I kept going long enough, my aunt would come, or the cousin in Memphis would call back, or the social worker would remember. I'm still thinking that. Most days I'm still thinking that. He looked up. His face was steady. He had not cried again. There was something in his eyes that was older than 12. "You're the first person who asked me a question and waited for the answer, sir. I think that's why." Edmund was quiet for a long time. He looked at the boy across the table, and he thought about a great many things at once. He thought about the small kitchen in Kentucky in 1953, and the smell of his father's pipe, and the sound of his mother singing low in the next room while she ironed a shirt for Sunday. He thought about Mrs. Kowalski, who was not in this story, but who lived in another story very much like it. A story he had once told a different child on a different evening in another city in another winter. He thought about his own dead wife, who had loved boys this age the most fiercely of all the ages of children, because she said they were the ones the world stopped paying attention to too soon. He thought about the long, careful catalog of decisions he had made and unmade across 81 years, and about which of those decisions had mattered in the end, and which of them had not, and he found, as he had found on perhaps a dozen other afternoons in his life, that the answer was almost always the same. The decisions that had mattered were the small ones made quickly in the cold on a sidewalk in front of a stranger who needed something he could provide. "Theo," he said, "I am going to tell you what I am going to do, and then I am going to ask you whether you will allow me to do it." "Yes, sir." "The first thing I am going to do," Edmund said, "is to make a telephone call. There is a woman named Frances Doyle who has worked with me for 31 years. She is a lawyer, but she does not look like a lawyer, and she does not speak like one when she is not in a courtroom, and she is the kindest person I know who has the word attorney on her business card. I am going to ask her to come and meet us. She knows the family court in this city better than anyone alive. She will know what calls to make on your behalf, and she will know who at the agency has been sitting on your file, and she will know how to ask them about it in a way that gets it moved to the top of the pile by the end of the week. That is the first thing." Theo did not say anything. His hands were very still on the table. "The second thing," Edmund said, "is that I am going to ask Mary, who I have known a long time, whether she would let us use her telephone in the back to make that call, and whether she would let you stay here in this booth, warm and out of the wind, until Frances arrives. I expect that to be no more than an hour. Mary, I imagine, will not mind." "I will not mind," Mary said without looking up from her newspaper. "The third thing," Edmund said, "and this is the one I am going to ask your permission for, is what we do this evening once Frances has come and we have all spoken together. I have a house. It is too large for one old man, and it has been too large for one old man for 7 years. There is a room on the lower floor with a bed in it and clean linens on the bed and a window that looks out onto a garden. There is a door on that room that locks from the inside, and you would be the only person with a key. There is a woman who lives in a small cottage on the property. Her name is Helen, and she keeps house for me, and she has known me longer than most of my own teeth. She is a grandmother several times over, and she would, I expect, be very pleased to have a young man at the kitchen table for a few mornings. He paused. He turned the cup in his hands. I am offering you that room, Theo, for tonight, for as many nights as you need while Francis helps us find the right next step. You would not be a guest who has to earn his keep. You would not be a project. You would be a young man under my roof, and you would be safe there, and the door would lock from the inside. I want to say that part again because I think it is the part that matters most. The door would lock from the inside, and the only key would belong to you. He set the cup down. You may say no. I am not offended by no. If you say no, I will still call Francis, and Francis will still help you, and Mary will still let you sit in this booth as long as you would like, and I will drive you to wherever in this city you tell me you would like to be driven. The offer of the room is separate from the offer of the help. The help is not a condition of anything. I want you to hear that clearly before you answer. Theo looked at him for a long time. He did not look at his hands. He did not look at the snow. He looked at the old man's face, the soft creases around the eyes, the deliberate stillness with which Edmund Hale had said what he had said, and he understood, in the way a child sometimes understands a thing before he has the vocabulary for it, that he was being spoken to by a person who had thought carefully about every word. Sir, he said, may I ask who you are? Edmund smiled a small, almost embarrassed smile. He had been waiting for the question, or some version of it, since the moment they had sat down. He had been hopping in the back of his mind that the question would not be necessary. My name is Edmund Hale, he said. I am 81 years old. I am from a town in Kentucky that does not exist anymore for the same reason most of those towns do not exist anymore. I started a small company a long time ago that made parts for grain elevators. The company grew in the way some companies do, and now it is a larger company that does other things, and I am retired from running it, though I still go to the office on Wednesdays because the chairman is my son and he humors me. I am, by the standards of most people, a wealthy man. I do not say that to impress you. I say it because I think you have a right to know what kind of help is being offered to you and by whom. Theo did not answer right away. He looked at the old man across the table, and at the long camel coat folded back at the wrists, and at the wooden cane leaning against the wall, and at the polished Oxford shoes with the careful teamster's bow tied at the left, and he tried to fit what he had just been told into the shape of what he was looking at. The fit, he found, was not difficult. He had known somewhere underneath his knowing since the moment Edmund had stepped out of the pharmacy with that particular kind of unhurried slowness that the man was not an ordinary man. He had simply not put a word to it. Now there was a word. Sir, Theo said, I didn't tie your lace because of who you are. I know that, Theo. I didn't know who you were. I know. I would have tied it anyway. I know that too. Edmund's voice had gone very soft. That is the part of you, Theo, that I am sitting here on account of. Theo nodded slowly. He picked up the mug of hot chocolate, and he found that his hand was steadier than it had been a few minutes earlier, and he took a small sip. He set the mug back down. He looked at the snow on the windowsill, which had now gathered into a small, soft ridge that the wind had stopped bothering to undo. Yes, sir, he said. I would like to come to your house tonight. Thank you. Edmund nodded once, the same small nod he had given when Theo had finished tying the lace, the nod of a man for whom a small, important agreement had been settled. He raised one hand very slightly off the table in Mary's direction, and Mary, who had been turning the same page of her newspaper for the last 10 minutes without reading it, came over to the booth with the unhurried calm of a person who had been waiting for the signal. Mary, Edmund said, may I use the telephone in the back? Of course, Edmund. And would you be willing to keep this young man company in this booth for an hour or so while I do? I would consider it an honor. Edmund rose, in the slow stages a man with a difficult hip rises, and took his cane in his right hand, and made his way down the narrow corridor at the back of the shop toward the small office where Mary kept the landline she had refused, against the advice of 3 different relatives, to give up. Mary slid into the booth across from Theo, and she did not say anything for a long moment, and then she said, He is a good man, Edmund Hale. I have known him since my husband was alive. He used to come in on Tuesdays for the coffee and on Thursdays for the apple cake. He still does when his hip allows him to. There are not very many like him left in the world, Theo. I want you to know that. Yes, ma'am. You did a kind thing on the sidewalk from what he told me. He likes kind things. He has spent a long life looking for them. It was just a lace, ma'am. It was not just a lace, Mary said, but you do not have to know that yet. Frances Doyle arrived in 46 minutes. She came through the door with a soft jingle of the bell and a long navy coat dusted with snow at the shoulders, and she did not look like a lawyer, exactly as Edmund had promised. She looked like a kindergarten teacher who had recently been promoted to principal and had not yet decided how she felt about it. She had a leather satchel over one shoulder and a thermos in one hand, and a pair of reading glasses pushed up on top of her head. And when she saw Theo in the corner booth, she smiled the wide, uncomplicated smile of a woman who had been told on the phone that she was about to meet a young man with a very good knot in him. "You must be Theo," she said. She did not put out her hand. She sat down beside him on his side of the booth with the comfortable ease of a person who knew that sitting across from someone in a small room was sometimes the wrong angle from which to begin a conversation. "I'm Frances. Edmund called me from the back office. He said the two of you have had quite an afternoon." "Yes, ma'am. I'm going to be on your side, Theo. I want you to know that before anything else. Whatever happens in the next few days, whoever I am talking to on the phone, whoever I am writing a letter to at the agency, whoever shows up at a door, I am on your side. Not Edmund's side, not the city's side, not the agency's side. Yours, do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good," Frances said. "Then let's begin." They spoke for a long while in that booth. Frances took notes in a small black book and asked careful questions, and Theo answered them in the same level voice he had used with Edmund. And Mary brought a fresh mug of hot chocolate without being asked, and a fresh cup of bad coffee for Edmund when he came back from the phone. And the snow outside the window kept falling in the steady way of a winter that had finally found its rhythm. By the time they left Murchison's that evening, Frances had made 3 phone calls and left 2 messages and written down 4 names she intended to speak with in the morning. And the door of the apartment on the building where Theo's mother had once lived had been quietly secured by a man Frances trusted, who promised that no one would knock on it until Theo and Frances were ready to be the ones knocking. The house Edmund drove Theo to that night was not the kind of house Theo had been imagining on the way over. It was a long, low stone house at the end of a quiet lane east of the city, with a porch light that had been left on for them and a wreath of dried lavender on the door. Helen was waiting in the front hall in a blue cardigan and reading glasses, with a small plate of shortbread on a side table that she had clearly forgotten she had baked, and she said only, "Welcome home, young man. The room is ready." And she did not make any other kind of fuss, because she had learned a long time ago that a boy arriving at a strange house in the snow did not need a fuss. The room had a window that looked out onto a garden under fresh snow, and a bed with a wool blanket folded at the foot, and a door that locked from the inside. Theo turned the key once that night just to feel the lock catch. Then he turned it back because he found that he did not need it locked. He left it that way unlocked for every night he ever spent in that house afterward. The story did not end there. Real stories never do. Frances Doyle made her phone calls in the morning, and the calls turned into meetings, and the meetings turned into a court date. And by the end of February, Theo's situation had been moved off a clipboard and into a folder and out of the folder and into a plan. His aunt was found. The cousin in Memphis was, in the end, not the cousin who would step forward, but his aunt was. And she came up to St. Louis on a Greyhound bus in early March and sat at Edmund's kitchen table for a long afternoon with Frances and Helen. And the 4 of them, with Theo in the room and his opinion asked at every turn, worked out an arrangement that put Theo in his aunt's home in University City by the end of the school year. With Edmund and Helen and Frances as the kind of people who were always 2 phone calls away from anything he might ever need. The aunt, whose name was Della, was a good woman who had been waiting on a clipboard of her own. She and Edmund became, against all reasonable expectation, friends. Years went by. Theo finished middle school in his aunt's neighborhood, and then high school, and he kept the small library copy of The Call of the Wild on the shelf above his bed long after the library had sent a polite letter forgiving the late fee. He went to a university in Missouri on a scholarship that Edmund had quietly funded under a name no one at the university ever traced. He studied social work because he had decided early on that what he wanted to do for a living was to be the person on the other end of the phone for boys who were waiting on clipboards. Edmund lived to see him graduate. He died on a quiet morning the autumn after, in the stone house at the end of the lane, with Helen in the kitchen and Frances on her way over and Theo, 23 years old by then, holding his hand. The lace on Edmund's left shoe that day was tied in a teamster's bow. In Edmund's will there was a letter for Theo. It was short. It said, "You tied my shoe on a sidewalk in the cold when no one else would have stopped. You did not know who I was. That is the only kind of kindness that ever changed anything in this world. Be that kind of person for someone else, Theo Whitfield, and the rest will follow. Theo runs a small organization in St. Louis now. It does not have a flashy name. It is called the Teamster's Bow, and it works with children who are waiting on clipboards. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment telling me what part you will carry with you, and subscribe for more stories of quiet kindness and second chances. Thank you for being here.